My wife betrayed me. I caught my wife cheating when I came back early from a business trip and saw her in bed with another man. Temporary duty assignments, or TDYs, can sometimes be enjoyable and adventurous. However, this particular one was far from it. It involved 25 days of nearly constant grueling work. Each year, the U.S. Army participates in a rapid deployment exercise where various units are chosen to be airlifted, along with all their equipment, to Germany. There, they engage in a month-long exercise with NATO counterparts. Hi, my name is David Thompson. At that time, I was a relatively new captain in the U.S. Army, working in the Operations Division at Fort Bragg, North Carolina. This deployment couldn't have come at a worse time. My wife was pregnant and due to deliver during my deployment. Sarah and I had been married for almost 7 years when I received the deployment orders. My commanding officer assured me, "I promise I'll do everything I can to get you home before the baby is born." He kept his word. As the exercise concluded, I packed my things and prepared to board a plane. I called Sarah, who mentioned she might be hospitalized in the next couple of days. "Perfect timing, then. I'm on my way home," I told her. It was dusk as I drove to the airport when a deer darted into the road. My driver swerved to avoid it, and the next thing I knew, I woke up in a military hospital in Frankfurt. My right arm, leg, and 3 ribs were broken, and my right lung had collapsed. "How long have I been here?" I asked the nurse. 5 days, she replied. "Is my wife here?" I inquired. "No, sir," I called Sarah. "Are you okay?" were her first words. "Don't worry about me. How are you and the baby?" I asked. She started to cry. "We lost the baby, David. I'm so sorry. Are you okay?" I asked again. "Physically, yes. Emotionally, I'm a mess," she admitted. 2 weeks later, I was flown home on a medical aircraft. Sarah met me and accompanied me to the base hospital. She was still an emotional wreck, but our time together helped both of us. I spent another 2 weeks in the hospital before being discharged on limited duty. 2 years after losing our child, we were transferred to Heidelberg, Germany, where we spent 3 years traveling all over Europe. During our time there, I was promoted to major. After 3 years, we were transferred to Fort Lewis, Washington. As a major, we were given field-grade officer quarters, which were much nicer and had garages instead of carports. When we moved into the house at Fort Lewis, all our belongings from Germany were sent back. We unpacked those boxes along with the ones we had stored and not taken with us. Using a box cutter, I began unpacking one of the many boxes. About halfway down, I found a small wooden box that I didn't remember seeing before. I placed it on top of the stack and opened it, and my life changed forever. Inside was a small stack of envelopes tied with a pink ribbon. I untied the ribbon and opened the top envelope. Inside was a birth certificate stating that a baby girl weighing 6 pounds 8 ounces and 20 inches long was born alive. The date matched the one Sarah had given me when she said our baby was stillborn. The baby was named Grace. The certificate listed the mother's name as Sarah Jane Thompson, and for the father's name, it said unknown. I picked up the next unsealed envelope and found a multi-page document and adoption certificate. I read it multiple times, trying to comprehend. It said a child named Grace, born to Sarah Thompson, had been given up for adoption and stripped of all parental rights. Since the biological father's identity was unknown, his permission wasn't required. How many men had she been with during that time? Did she even know? Even in marriage, we need personal space and private thoughts. I drove to the golf course, parked the car, and headed to the clubhouse, where there was a bar, diner, and restaurant. I ordered 2 eggs over medium and corned beef hash, which used to be my favorite breakfast until Sarah changed my eating habits. I managed to eat most of it, and then sat on the deck watching the golfers finish the 18th hole. When I got home, it was midday. Sarah had made significant progress in unpacking boxes and organizing the house. I went to my unit and into the office, but there was no one there except the officer on duty. I tried to work but couldn't concentrate. When I got home past midnight, Sarah was in bed reading. I undressed, took a shower, and announced, "I'll sleep downstairs," as I walked out and closed the door. I had just turned on the TV and was getting comfortable on the couch when Sarah walked in, grabbed the remote, turned off the TV, and stared at me. "Cut the crap. Tell me what's wrong and I'll either help you or leave. Which is it? I haven't done anything wrong, so I won't tolerate you yelling at me or having to get out of your way." I took the remote from her hands and turned the TV back on. Have a safe trip, I said. She left less than an hour later. On Monday morning, I spoke to my commander explaining the situation and showing him the documents. He was as shocked as I was. "What do you plan to do?" he asked. "I'm not sure. She didn't say where she was going when she left, but she didn't take all her things, especially the box," I replied. There was a pause before I continued. "I was thinking of trying to find my daughter, if she is my daughter, and proceed from there. It would be virtually impossible. Adoption confidentiality is very strict," he said. "I understand, but I have to start somewhere. I don't trust Sarah to tell me the truth anymore." Suddenly, an idea hit me. "Oh my God, I have an idea. Can I have the day off?" I asked. He agreed, and I saluted and ran out of his office, jumped into my car, and drove home. I opened the box, pulled out a wooden box, and dumped the contents on the floor. There was a pacifier, likely Grace's. I put it in a clear plastic bag and sealed it. I searched online for a DNA lab in the area and found one in downtown Seattle. I rummaged through the bathroom cabinets, found Sarah's old hairbrush, and put it in another bag with the pacifier. Then I drove to the lab. "We'll call you in about 3 weeks," the lab technician said. I didn't hear from Sarah for another day. "Hi," I said when she called. "Are you feeling better?" "Better than what?" "Better than the idiot you were a couple of days ago," she snapped. "No, same old idiot. Why?" "In 3 weeks, I'll know if I'm going to eliminate you or just divorce you," I replied, and ended the call. The phone rang immediately, but I ignored it. The next day, Sarah was home when I arrived. She met me at the car, furious. "What do you mean you're going to either eliminate me or divorce me?" she demanded. "Exactly what I said," I responded. "I think I deserve an explanation," she demanded. "Me too," I replied. "About what?" she asked as we stood in the driveway. "You mean you don't need to explain anything?" I asked, emphasizing the word need. "That's exactly what I'm saying," she responded, irritation in her voice. "So there's no hope for us?" I asked, stressing the word hope. "What do you mean, no hope?" "What have I done?" she retorted. Suddenly, realization hit her. "Oh my God, no. Please, no," she begged. "I'll be back in an hour and you better not be here. I'll leave for work at 6:30 in the morning and be back by 5. By then, all your stuff should be out of this house." I left and returned exactly an hour later, but she was gone along with the box and some of her things. When I got home in the evening, the house was nearly empty. She had taken most of the furniture, leaving only my favorite chair and a guest bedroom set. The next morning, I called my office to inform them I'd be late. Then I contacted Post Housing to arrange for temporary government furniture. I also called the credit union, our stockbroker, the insurance company, and anyone else I could think of, dealing with the mundane tasks usually associated with divorce. I made an appointment with a Judge Advocate General JAG lawyer, knowing they couldn't represent me in civilian court but could offer advice. They confirmed my suspicion that she would get half of everything. Since we lived in public housing, we didn't own a house, but we had enough equity to buy one if we wanted to. Both our cars were paid off. Life continued for a couple more weeks. I went to work, did my chores, mowed the lawn, and cleaned my car. One morning, the phone rang. "Hello?" I answered. "Is this Major David Thompson?" a voice asked. "Yes, it is," I replied. "Major Thompson, this is Jessica from the DNA Analysis Center. A few weeks ago, you gave us some samples to test." "Yes, I did," I confirmed. "Well, the results are in, and you can come in to see them." "Can't you just tell me now?" I asked. "No, sir, I can't. We can either mail them to the address you gave us or show them to you in person. We have no way to verify over the phone that you are who you say you are. We need to see identification. We can mail the results because, as you may recall, we verified your ID and address when you were here. I'll be there as soon as I can," I said. I walked through their door, introduced myself, and asked for Jessica. She came out, and we shook hands. After showing her my ID, she led me into a small room and asked me to wait. She returned a couple of minutes later, handed me the pacifier, and explained, "Sample A is yours. Sample B is from the hair you gave us, and Sample C is from the pacifier. We determined that Samples B and C are positively related. Sample A is not related to either B or C." "Thank you," I said, pocketing the pacifier, taking the papers, and leaving. At least I didn't have a daughter calling another man daddy. But someone else did. JAG couldn't recommend specific law firms or attorneys, but the officer I spoke with provided a list of approved ones. The next day, I started calling. After 6 appointments, I found my Gaia-retired JAG officer who hated cheating spouses of both genders. I spent over an hour telling him my story. When I got home late, there was a letter in the mailbox from Sarah. "David, 3 weeks are up." Sarah, it read, short and to the point. The return address was her parents' place in Harrisburg, Pennsylvania. I called her. "Hi, Sarah," she answered. "I won't discuss this over the phone, and I'm not flying to Pennsylvania, so you'll have to come here," I said. "If you mean Seattle, I'm already here. I sent the letter last week when I was there. I'll be at the house at 6:30. "Come over then," I told her, and she hung up. I made no special arrangements, no drinks, no cheese, no crackers, nothing. This was strictly a business meeting. I placed the DNA documents, birth certificate copies, and adoption papers on the government-issued coffee table. She pulled into the driveway at 6:20, but waited until exactly 6:30 to ring the bell. I wasn't in a hurry to answer. Opening the door, I invited her in and pointed to where she should sit. I sat on the couch, and she took the uncomfortable straight-back chair across from me. I reached into my pocket, pulled out the pacifier, and held it out to her. She grabbed it and held it to her chest. "Thank you," she said, as if I'd given her $1 million. Then I handed her a copy of the DNA test results. "You already know I'm not the father, but this will confirm it," I said. She took the results with her left hand, clutching the pacifier in her right. "I take it you're sample A?" she asked. "Yes," I replied. Then I pushed the rest of the papers toward her without a word. She leaned forward, read the title on the top sheet, and tears welled up in her eyes. She set the DNA results aside and picked up the dissolution of marriage application. She started reading but couldn't continue as tears fell onto the form. "Can I have a tissue?" she asked. "I don't have any," I replied coldly. "You're not making this easy for me, are you?" she asked. "You cheated," I stated. She nodded. "How many times?" I asked. "Does it matter?" she responded. "No, I just want to know. One weekend." "Different, just one," I corrected. "Who is he? Does it really matter?" "Again, I just want to know. I think I deserve it." "I'm not going to tell you. Do I know him?" "I'm not going to tell you. So you'd rather protect him than try to save your marriage?" She picked up the divorce petition. "Our marriage is over anyway. Why ruin it further?" "Okay, but you have to tell me why you lied about our daughter being stillborn. When I found out I was pregnant, I wasn't sure if it was your baby or his. I thought about getting an abortion but couldn't go through with it. Over time, I convinced myself you wouldn't know for sure if the baby was yours. When we found out it was a girl, I was even more certain. There's a special bond between a dad and daughter, and I was sure you and she would look alike. As her birth approached, I got nervous. Maybe you'd find out she wasn't yours. When you went away on a business trip, my nerves calmed down. I was glad you wouldn't be there when she was born. But then you told me you were flying home and my anxiety returned. My emotions were on a roller coaster. Maybe you'd know. Maybe you wouldn't. Maybe you'd be there when she was born. Maybe you wouldn't. I was nervous. Then she was born alive and perfect. They placed her on my chest and I fell in love. She was beautiful, with blonde hair and blue eyes. She paused, just like her father's. You have brown hair and brown eyes. No one in our families has blonde hair and blue eyes. I knew she wasn't yours. She was my daughter, and you were my husband. I loved you both, but I knew I had to choose between you. I chose you. The hospital staff helped me when I said I wanted to give her up for adoption. Within 24 hours, I had the papers. They asked who the baby's father was, and I said I didn't know. They said it would be easier that way, since if I knew the father's identity, they'd need his permission. I just held her and bonded with her. She was sucking on a pacifier when they brought me the papers to sign. I knew I had to tell you something, so I concocted the story that she was stillborn and her remains were cremated. When you came home, I was shocked that you didn't ask to see any proof, no birth certificate, no death certificate, nothing. I still can't believe it. I trusted you, I said. I had no reason to doubt you. The whole situation was so traumatic that I didn't see the need to add to our pain by looking at those documents. Eventually, we got back to a semblance of normalcy, and I was almost happy. But a part of me was always missing. It still is. It gets worse every year on her birthday. I always took out her birth certificate, touched her little footprints, and held her pacifier. Sometimes I wanted to put it in my mouth to feel closer to her, but it had some of my dried breast milk on it, and I wanted to preserve that. They must have scraped it off at the DNA lab. "Oh my God, it's gone," she moaned. looking at me with horror. "Her milk is gone. You idiot, you took her milk." She collapsed to her knees, curling into a ball on the floor. I picked her up and laid her on the couch, covering her with a blanket. I couldn't let her leave in that condition. I went to my bedroom but didn't go to sleep. She stayed there for hours. Around midnight, I heard the toilet flush and went downstairs to find her sitting on the couch. "Would you like some coffee?" I asked. "Yes, please," she answered. She sat at the counter while I brewed a cup. She took a sip. "I guess I got a little cold feet, huh?" "Sort of," I replied. We sat in silence, sipping our coffee. "More?" I asked. "Yes, please," she said. "Where are you staying?" I asked as I brewed 2 more cups. "At the motel." "You've been there for more than 3 weeks?" "No, I was with my parents most of the time." "Do they know the truth?" "No, I lied to them too. I told them that you and I were going through a rough patch and I needed to get away. They paid for me to visit them. They think I came back to help work things out." She looked around, walked over to the coffee table, pulled a pen from her purse, sat down, signed the divorce papers without reading them, and left. When I woke up, it was the middle of Sunday morning. I spent the rest of the day reflecting. On Monday, I took the divorce papers to my attorney, and he filed them. I've been obsessing over who Sarah cheated with. She never revealed his identity or how the affair started. It wasn't just the cheating and the pregnancy that infuriated me. It was her defending the guy and refusing to tell me who he was. The only thing she admitted was that it lasted just 1 weekend. Fortunately, my busy work schedule kept my mind occupied. 2 weeks later, I returned to Fort Bragg, where Sarah and I had been living when her daughter was born. Usually, military seminars are intense, but this one was relaxed. We were divided into groups of 3 to work on a project. It turned out there were 6 groups of 3, and 2 people were left a major from Alaska and myself. We bonded almost immediately, as if we had known each other for years. His name was Brian Parker, and he was stationed in Alaska at Fort Greely, the coldest base in the U.S. Army, but he loved it. He was a computer genius, and we were so far ahead of everyone else that we had to slow down and wait for them to catch up. On Friday of the first week, we had lunch at the officers' club. Brian confided in me about his personal life. He had cheated on his wife, and she divorced him. She now lived with a civilian, and his 2 children called the other man Daddy. Toward the end of lunch, I shared my story. When I finished, Brian had a peculiar look in his eyes. "And you don't know who the man she had an affair with is?" "No, she didn't tell me." "And that was here at Bragg?" "Yes, almost 6 years ago. Blonde hair and blue eyes, right?" "That's what she said." "Come with me." We headed to the Manpower Center, where everyone assigned to Fort Bragg had to check in. We walked straight into the HR director's office. She saw us, stood up, and went around her desk to give Brian a hug. She looked to be about 60 years old with a sparkle in her eyes. I liked her instantly, even though I hadn't spoken to her yet. "Mary, this is David Thompson." "Hi, David," she said, shaking my hand. "Hello, Mrs. Smith," I began. "Call me Aunt Mary. Everyone does." "Aunt Mary," Brian began. "Do you remember a fair-haired, blue-eyed officer who may have been here about 6 years ago?" She thought for a few seconds. "No, but I don't always see everyone who passes through here. They all have to, but that doesn't mean I see them." She thought some more. "David Thompson, you were here around that time, weren't you? I remember that name." "Yes, my wife and I were here," I said, looking at Brian, puzzled about how she remembered. "Brian," I began, "Aunt Mary has Sam. She can remember just about anything she's read, seen, or been involved with. That includes people. She can remember everyone she's ever met." "Sam?" I asked. "Yes, superior autobiographical memory. It's a state of being," Brian said. "Or a curse," Aunt Mary interjected. "Or a curse," Brian continued. "Very few people have it. Aunt Mary is Fort Bragg's institutional memory, especially when it comes to personnel matters. Isn't that right, Aunt Mary?" "Unfortunately," she replied. I looked at her, then at Brian, then back at her. "You remember everything? Everything that happens to me personally." "Jesus," I said. "How do you have room for all this?" "We don't know. It's just always there." "Does it have any downsides?" I asked. "Oh, God, yes. I remember the good as well as the bad. It can cause depression if you allow yourself to dwell on it." "I can only imagine," I told her. "Aunt Mary," Brian interrupted again. "David," he pointed at me. "He's looking for someone who was here at the same time." The only thing he knows about him is that he was blonde with blue eyes. She laughed. That's it? No height, no weight, no rank, no assignment, not even his initials? No, ma'am, I said. Calling me ma'am is a waste of good oxygen, David. I'm Aunt Mary. Give me time to think and maybe ask around. Does it matter? Brian looked at me and I answered, Yes, Aunt Mary. It's important. Oh, he was about the same age as me when I was here, if that helps. And he was in the Army? Officer or private? I suppose he was an officer if he was in the Army. So you don't even know if he was in the service? No, I don't. Or a civil servant? No, I'm sorry. I know it's not much to go on. She laughed. Yeah, there's just nothing to target there. There can't be more than 2,000 blonde-haired, blue-eyed men I've encountered in the last few years, but I'll see if I can narrow down the time frame. She took both of our phone numbers. 2 days later, she called Brian. I've been thinking about the man you asked about. I don't remember any blonde-haired, blue-eyed soldiers, either officers or privates, who were about the right age, but I know 2 civilians who work for the Office of Post Engineers. One has worked there for about 30 years, so he's probably too old. The other has been working there for about 10 years. He's in charge of new construction now, but used to be the head of the plumbing department. His name is John Walker. There are about 15 other blue-eyed blondes on post, but the ages don't fit. I didn't bother trying to remember civilians living off base because I assumed that when Major Thompson was here, he didn't have time to make many civilian friends. Brian filled me in, and I immediately started plotting how to meet Walker, find out if he was the right man, and maybe get a little revenge. Men who prey on the wives of our military personnel are among the lowest forms of life, second only to those who prey on wives while their husbands are overseas. These guys deserve the worst fate imaginable. The next morning, I sat in my rental car on the street over from Walker's house, hoping he was into golf or DIY projects and might be heading to the local hardware store. I had been waiting for almost 2 hours when his car finally pulled out of the garage and sped down the street. Thank God, I thought. I wasn't looking forward to sitting there all day, but I was ready to, if necessary. I followed him to Home Depot. We parked, and I tailed him into the store. He was obviously well known there, chatting with several employees. There was a spot right in front of the door with a coffee station for regular contractors. Walker helped himself to a cup and stood sipping his drink while chatting with a salesman behind the counter. Watching Walker, I realized not only had he been with my wife, but he also chewed gum with his mouth open, almost as disgusting as spitting on the sidewalk. The clerk Walker was chatting with had to help a customer, so Walker took one last sip of coffee, spit his gum into a paper cup, and walked away while unwrapping another piece of gum. I walked over to the trash can, saw the cup right on top, and took it when no one was looking. I got in my car and called Brian. I told him what I had and he laughed, urging me to hurry back. I might have something bigger by the time you get here, he said. When I arrived, Brian was literally bouncing around, waving some papers. You're not going to believe this, he exclaimed. No, really, you won't believe it. He grabbed my arm. Look at this. No, you better sit down. I did. And he sat next to me, placing the papers in front of me. Look, he said. There were names and an address. So what? I asked. That's Grace's name, address, and her family's name. Her name is Grace Carter now. I hacked into the files of an adoption agency. Those files are more encrypted than the nuclear missile launch codes carried by the President of the United States. Then he calmed down a bit. Well, I didn't personally hack the files. My brother did, but it's the same thing. I started to laugh. That's great, Brian, but what exactly am I going to do with this? This? I have no idea, but you have them. Maybe we can blackmail someone. Oh, that's great. I can already see the headlines. 2 Army officers tried to blackmail a 6-year-old foster child. That's a great one. I tossed the papers on the coffee table and leaned back. Yeah, I see your point, he said, getting flustered. But we cracked their defenses. That's something. Yeah, that's something, I said, laughing. I carried the papers and the coffee cup back to my quarters and placed them on the desk. For some reason, I looked up the address where Grace lived and decided to drive there early Sunday morning. It was nearly 150 miles to the town. The house was a typical suburban home. I sat outside for about an hour, observing American suburbia on a typical Sunday, the noise of lawnmowers, the screams of children, and the chatter of neighbors. No activity came from Grace's house until almost noon when a car pulled into the driveway. There were 3 people inside, a man driving, a woman in the front passenger seat, and a child in the right rear seat. The woman got out, closed her door, and reached for the rear door. I readied my cell phone. The woman took the child out, placed her on the ground, and knelt to straighten the girl's dress. I had just enough time to snap a few pictures. I heard a noise next to my car. A woman and a child were walking by. The child next to my car squealed and ran towards another child who I realized was Grace. They were only a few feet away, so I took a few more quick pictures. I started my car and drove off before either of the two women noticed the strange car and man parked on their street. I stopped a short distance away to review the pictures. 4 of them were perfect. I could even make out Grace's blue eyes. I drove back to Fort Bragg. The following week, Brian and I finished the course with ease. We graduated on Friday and had dinner and a few drinks together. On Saturday morning, we went to the airport and flew home Brian to Alaska and me to Seattle. The following Monday, I took Sarah and the DNA reports to the DNA testing center. The technician didn't remember me until I reminded her about the pacifier. I handed her Sarah and Grace's DNA results and the coffee cup with gum. "See you in 3 weeks," I said as I left. In fact, it only took 2 weeks this time. She gave me the results over the phone. It's a match. No doubt mother, father, and child. I'll send you the official results in the mail. Okay. I had all the information I needed, but what was I going to do with it? It only confirmed that Walker was indeed the guy Sarah had cheated with. I went to Walmart and bought paper and envelopes. I also made copies of 2 photographs of Grace and the DNA reports for Walker, Sarah, and Grace. I cut off anything that could identify where the reports came from. I put everything in an envelope, making sure to wear gloves from the moment I opened the bag of paper and box of envelopes. I used self-adhesive stamps and water, not saliva, to seal the envelope. I made every effort to keep it untraceable. I addressed it to Mrs. John Walker at their home address. I also included Sarah's name and her parents' address because I had no idea where she was then. I drove to Seattle's main post office and dropped the letter in the mailbox. A little over a month later, I got a call from Aunt Mary. "I'm going to ask you a question and I want an honest answer," she said. "I'll do my best. Whatever you're doing isn't good enough. I need complete honesty." "Is that what you and Brian did to Walker?" "Aunt Mary, I don't mean to sound smart, but what did we do to him? Set him up so his wife would file for divorce." "Okay, here's what I did. Brian had nothing to do with it," I said, telling her most of the truth and omitting Brian's part. "You certainly stirred up a hornet's nest. Apparently, when his wife received your package, she didn't know if the DNA was his or someone else's, so she did it herself. She took some of his DNA and sent it off for processing. She also sent the profiles of that woman and the baby. They matched, and that's when it all went downhill." "Who was the woman he was flirting with?" she asked. "My wife, Aunt Mary," I replied. "Oh, Jesus," Aunt Mary muttered. "I had a feeling it might be something like that. He was brought into the office yesterday, and he's not happy. He was ranting and raving all over the base. Hearing that his marriage is over is the best news I've heard in a while. I just feel sorry for his family. With Sarah and I divorced and Walker on his way to the same, I felt a strange sense of closure. I folded the papers Brian had given me and put them in a box with other things I no longer needed but kept anyway. My life moved on. Over the next few months, I went on a couple of dates, but nothing significant happened. 2 years later, I was back at Fort Bragg. I was surprised because I expected an overseas assignment like most of my classmates. Once back at Bragg, I found myself in Aunt Mary's office. "How did you get back here?" she asked. "I have no idea," I replied. "Yes," came a familiar voice. It was newly promoted Lieutenant Colonel Brian Parker. He walked into the office, closed the door, and we shook hands. "I needed an assistant, and a major who had just graduated from CGS was just what I needed, so I requested you." Brian and I had kept in touch sporadically since the seminar, but hadn't seen each other. I was glad to see him. After registering, I took a 2-week vacation. The first thing I did was look for a house. Sarah and I had been saving up to buy one, and I assumed she would get half in the divorce, but since she didn't show up in court, I got everything. I met the branch manager, Michael Carter, who introduced himself and mentioned they had moved to a new neighborhood about 6 months ago. "The houses are very nice and affordable. You get a lot of value for your money," he said. He gave me a business card for the real estate agent he used. I called her, and in 3 days, I found the perfect house. I paid more than half the down payment, and the bank was happy to finance the rest. I started working with Brian and moved into my new house. The first things I bought were a bed, a chair, a big TV, and a lawnmower. On my first night there, it was dark, and I had no curtains or drapes. I didn't even have enough sheets to cover the big front window. I had just opened a beer and was holding a slice of pepperoni pizza when the doorbell rang. I had long since abandoned the no-red meat diet Sarah had imposed on me. I opened the door and a woman stood there. "Hi, neighbor," she said. "I'm Rachel Carter, but everyone calls me Rachel. We live nearby. I just wanted to say hello, introduce myself, and let you know that if you need anything, just ask. Is your wife here?" I smiled. "David Thompson. No wife. Divorced." I saw her frown. "But don't worry. I don't throw wild parties," I added. She smiled, and we chatted for a few minutes before she left. The first week in my new home flew by. On Saturday morning, 3 women rang the doorbell and brought food along with decorating ideas. They had seen my empty house lit up at night with me sitting inside with just a chair, TV, beer, and pizza. They decided it was time to help me. The ringleader was Rachel Carter. Within a couple of hours, I had a slightly worn but nice leather couch, a dining table and chairs, and a small coffee table. The ladies were about to leave when 3 small children came running in, chasing each other. One of the women, Ruth, grabbed 2 of the kids, and Rachel grabbed the third. "Calm down, Grace," she said, kneeling beside the child and brushing her blonde hair away from her blue eyes. "This is our new neighbor, Major Thompson." "Hello," Grace said confidently. I leaned over. "Hi, Grace," I said, looking into her piercing blue eyes, blonde hair and blue eyes. I shook my head. "How old are you, Grace?" "I'll be 7 soon." After they left, I went to my den, found the right box, opened it, and pulled out a folder. The pictures I had taken were there. It was the same baby. I hadn't paid attention to the names of the adoptive parents before, but now I did. The adoption papers named Michael and Rachel Carter as Grace's adoptive parents. Over the next few weeks, Rachel and her friends helped me decorate my house. Once it was done, we had a neighborhood open house. Rachel invited her sister-in-law, Natalie Johnson, who was divorced. I hadn't enjoyed female companionship in a long time, and Natalie and I hit it off right away. She was the last to leave the party, and I couldn't wait to call her the next day. We met for lunch and had dinner with Michael, Rachel, and Grace. Grace only made a brief appearance because she wanted to play with her friends. Over the next few months, Natalie and I saw each other as often as possible. The first night we spent together was wonderful. We were sitting at the kitchen island when the doorbell rang. I threw on my robe and went to answer it. It was Rachel. "Good afternoon, David," she said, walking in. "We were wondering." She saw Natalie. "Well, what do we have here?" she asked, heading toward her sister-in-law. Natalie was sitting on a stool eating a ham and cheese sandwich. As Rachel approached, Natalie set the sandwich aside and turned to face her. Her robe was open, and Rachel reached up to close it. Natalie laughed. "Too late for modesty, sis. He's already seen everything. In fact, Hez." Rachel began. "Never mind," Natalie interrupted. I left the room and went upstairs to get dressed. When I came back, they were still discussing my bedspread. Seeing that I was dressed, they fell silent. The following weekend, Michael and Rachel asked Natalie to watch Grace while they went out to dinner. We were in the backyard watching Grace in her sandbox. Without looking at Natalie, I said, "She's a beautiful child, isn't she?" "Yes, she is." "Did you know she was adopted?" "Really?" "Yes. They've had her since she was born. According to the adoption agency, the birth mother was married but had an affair with a man she doesn't even remember and got pregnant. Her husband was in the military. She didn't want him to find out about the affair, so she gave Grace up for adoption. Michael and Rachel were there to take her home. Grace is the name her birth mother gave her." "No, that name was Hope. It's on the birth certificate, but Rachel and Michael changed it. Grace suits her better. What happened to the birth mother and her husband, I have no idea. The adoption agency keeps their files very tight. They don't give the birth mother access to information about the adoptive family and vice versa." Grace came over and wanted to sit on Natalie's lap. She leaned her head against Natalie's and fell asleep almost immediately. A few minutes later, Natalie asked me to carry Grace to the bedroom and put her to bed. It was my first time touching her, and I felt very uncomfortable. I gladly laid her down. 7 months later, Natalie moved in with me. A year after that, we were married. We had a very happy year until the Army intervened. We were told we were being sent to Germany for 3 years of service. We took 2 trips to the State Zone when her father and Michael's father died, and the other for a reunion. Both times, of course, we saw Michael and Rachel. We saw Grace at the funeral, but when we went back for the reunion, she was at camp. 3 years later, I received orders to transfer to Fort Benning, Georgia. I was assigned as a new lieutenant colonel to the post headquarters as an executive officer under the post commander. This role was typically reserved for a full colonel, but in the military, you don't question your luck. To help me settle in, the staff arranged a series of briefings with various departments that support the post. One of these briefings was to be given by the Postal Engineering Department. As I entered the conference room, representatives from that department, including the postal engineer himself, were already seated. I took my place and watched as a blue-eyed civilian with slightly graying blonde hair stood up to start his presentation. He introduced himself as John Walker. My heart skipped a beat. He talked for an hour, but I didn't hear a word. My eyes never left his face, and it was clear he noticed my intense gaze. At the end of his speech, he asked if there were any questions. "Tell me, Mr. Walker, have you ever been to Fort Bragg?" I asked. "Yes, sir. I was part of the engineering department," he replied. "Did you enjoy your time there?" I continued. "Yes, sir," he said, looking increasingly uncomfortable. "Why did you leave?" "That's personal, sir," he responded, shifting nervously. "Fair enough. I'd just like to know about the people I work with," I said, leaning back. "I seem to recall a scandal at the Fort Bragg engineering department a few years ago. Do you know anything about that?" He hesitated. "I vaguely remember something about someone cheating, if I'm not mistaken." Well, thank you for the briefing. If you need anything at headquarters, feel free to contact me." I pointed to the name tag on my uniform. "My name is Thompson, David Thompson. I wouldn't want you to forget it." Recognition dawned in his eyes, which widened in shock. His face turned various shades of red and gray. I got up and walked away. That afternoon, I learned that Mr. John Walker had requested a transfer. Unfortunately for him, this request had to go through me. The next day, I received his request and wrote in a large letter response, "I have plans that require Mr. Walker's expertise. He will play a key role in these plans." The following day, Mr. John Walker tendered his immediate resignation, which I promptly signed. As time passed, my love for Natalie grew every day. I watched her become more vibrant and beautiful. Each morning, I saw an aging man in the mirror and wondered what she saw in me. Whatever it was, I was grateful for it. We treasured our time together, and the years flew by. We were stationed in Alaska and decided to visit Rachel and Michael. During our first evening, they shared a decision they had made with Grace, who was almost 18. She had always known she was adopted and now wanted to find her biological parents. Michael and Rachel supported her decision, but the adoption agency offered no assistance, citing legal compliance. They vented about outdated laws and the need for reform, especially for adopted children to know their birth parents' health status. They decided to use a DNA and ancestry website. They sent Grace's DNA and waited for results, hoping her biological mother could attend her high school graduation, though it was only a couple of weeks away. That night, Natalie and I were already in bed when she asked, "What are you going to do about Grace?" "About what?" I played dumb. "Come on, David. Married couples shouldn't have secrets. I found your little file 6 months after we got married. Grace doesn't need DNA testing if you tell them what you know." "Oh, crap," I muttered. "Yeah, oh, crap. Why have you been silent all these years?" "I'm not sure. I guess I knew how sensitive you'd be about it, and Michael and Rachel didn't need to know. So I kept quiet. But now it's important, and you have to address it. Any ideas on how to handle this? Just tell the story." "How do you think they'll react? Michael is my brother, so hell, take it in stride. Rachel is the unknown." "Okay, tomorrow we'll get Grace out of the house and tell them." She leaned over and kissed me gently. "Do I ever bore you?" she asked. "What a silly question," I said. "Of course you don't. Why did you even ask?" "Because you haven't touched me all day." I grinned and reached for the buttons on her pajamas. "I can fix that right now." The next morning was Sunday. Grace was picked up by her best friend, and they went to the mall. I gathered the 4 of us around the table, took a deep breath, and began. I started by telling them that Natalie and I had packed our things before we came downstairs, so we were ready if they wanted to kick us out. They looked at us, and Natalie shrugged. Grace doesn't need to give DNA to find her biological parents. I know who they are, I said. Their expressions made it clear I needed to explain, so I told them the whole story. When I finished, I took a deep breath and looked around the table. Michael just stared at me while Rachel had tears in her eyes. After a few seconds, she stood up, walked over to me, took my hands, pulled me into a hug, and said, "Oh, poor guy, living with that all these years and not being able to talk about it, no one deserves that." She hugged me again. "What do you think, Michael?" she asked her husband. "I'm trying to calculate the odds of how we all ended up together." "I don't think there's a big enough number," he said with a wry smile. "So what do we do now?" Rachel asked as she returned to her chair. "I think David should contact his ex-wife and invite her to Grace's graduation since she wants her there," Natalie suggested. "Why me?" I protested. "Because you started this," Michael grinned. "But who's going to contact Walker?" "Not me," I said, recounting the last time I saw him. "You never told me that," Natalie said, surprised. "I didn't realize you knew the whole story." I leaned over and kissed her. "I love this woman," I thought. Later that day, when Grace returned, Michael and Rachel told her everything. She was both nervous and excited and wanted us to continue. The only way I knew to contact Sarah was through her parents, if they were still alive, still lived in Harrisburg, and still had a landline. I waited until Monday morning and talked to a private investigator. I asked him to help me find Sarah's parents and John Walker. It took him 2 hours to get the parents' phone number and longer to find Walker. I called Sarah's parents, reminded them who I was, and told them I needed to talk to Sarah. I gave them my phone number to pass on to her. Less than an hour later, my phone rang. "Hello, this is Sarah Martin." I was given this number. "Hi, Sarah, it's David." "David, wow, how's it going?" she asked, sounding taken aback. "Actually, I am doing great. How are you?" "Very well. Sarah, I need to talk to you about something very important." "Okay, go ahead. Not over the phone. Tell me where we can meet, and we'll talk in person. Explain it to me. We haven't spoken in years, and suddenly you have something so important that it needs to be discussed in person." "I'm sorry, David. I'm not buying it." "Okay, but remember I gave you a chance." "A chance at what?" "Come on, David, what's this about?" "Only in person, Sarah. Call me if you change your mind." "Wait, okay, damn it. We live in Las Vegas. That's better. I'm flying out there tomorrow. I'll call you when I land and you decide where you want to meet." The next day, we met in the lobby of the Bellagio Hotel. I guess she wanted plenty of witnesses. "Hi, Sarah." "Hello, David. This is my husband, Eric. Eric Martin." "Hi, Eric." I turned back to Sarah. "I need to see you alone for 10 seconds. Anything you have to say, you can say in front of Eric. Whatever you say. But this is about the baby you had." She turned pale. "Can we still talk?" "Yes, he knows about her." "Okay, let's sit down." We found a quieter corner and ordered some wine. Once it was poured, I took a deep breath and began. "Her name is Grace. She's graduating in 2 weeks and wants you to be there." Eric and I watched as Sarah fainted, her wine glass still in hand. Eric took the glass, set it down, and patted her cheeks until she came to. "What did you say?" I repeated it and then showed her Grace's picture. She started crying, gently touching the photo. "She's beautiful. Where did you get this?" "I took it yesterday in her living room." "You took it? How? Why?" I recounted the entire story, including our failed attempt to find John Walker. She didn't know I knew his name and was shocked. Initially stunned, she quickly grew angry. "Why didn't you ever tell me? Why did you keep her from me all these years?" Her voice grew louder. Eric jumped up. "Calm down. You gave up all rights to her. David is breaking the law by doing this now, so chill out." She calmed down. "When can I see her?" "At her graduation, if you want to come." "Of course, I'll come. Can't I see her sooner? You both need time to get used to it. How about coming the day before?" She smiled. "That would be wonderful. Now how about I take a picture of you so she can see what you look like?" "Okay." We found a spot outside for her to pose. When I started to leave, she rushed over, hugged me, and kissed my face and head. "Not too demonstrative, is she?" asked Eric, laughing. I decided I liked him. That same afternoon, I flew back to prepare Grace. I showed her a picture of Sarah. "She's beautiful," Grace said. She was very nervous, but excited at the same time. For the first time since I'd known her, she hugged me. "Thank you, Uncle David." "Now we know where you get your beauty," said Rachel, hugging Grace. "Do you know what my birth father looks like?" Grace asked, timidly. The other three adults looked at me with widened eyes, waiting to hear what I would say. I thought for a moment before speaking. You got your blonde hair and blue eyes from him. The adults sighed with relief. We had only taken a week's vacation, so I had to return to Alaska. Natalie stayed behind to help everyone prepare for the big day. I promised to be back 2 days before graduation. The day before I was due back, I got a call from the private investigator. The most he had found out about Walker was that after leaving government service, he took a consulting job in a Middle Eastern country. Like several other American consultants, he disappeared shortly after arriving and hasn't been seen since. I met Sarah and Eric at the airport and drove them straight to Grace's house. When we entered, she stood in the middle of the living room. I let Sarah go first. They looked at each other for a long moment before Sarah spoke. "I brought you this," she said, pulling out a pacifier. "It belongs to you, and I thought you might want it back."